It was the seizures holding her back, and that she wasn't a responder to any of the medications. And once she got on CBD, now she's not, and she's still my patient now. We're going on like 12 years. She's one of my first patients I saw. She's not fully seizure free, but boy, does she have a really decent life.
Welcome to the KayaCast, the podcast for cannabis businesses looking to launch, grow, and scale their operations.
Dr. Bonni, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me to be here.
It's not very often that I have a medical doctor that's a cannabis expert too on the pod, so I'm very grateful for this conversation.
There's not very many of us, but I'm working very hard to increase the numbers of clinicians who understand cannabis medicine.
So, and I want to ask what led you to cannabis? Because you're right, not a lot of doctors, MDs, go into the cannabis industry.
It's true. So I worked for many years as a pediatric emergency medicine clinician. I trained in pediatrics at Children's LA. And then I was about, 12 years in, working at night mostly, weekends, because I had a little boy at home that I wanted to also spend time with. And I took a leave of absence just because I was burned out and I was really frustrated with the medical system, with arguing with insurance companies, with the usual stuff that goes on in an ER. If you've ever been in an ER, it's like the last place anybody ever wants to be. But I enjoyed it. I was an adrenaline junkie. I enjoyed it. And I enjoyed being able to make a difference in children's lives in that way. But as I said, I took a leave of absence just kind of to reset myself, my own kind of, sleep deprived, stressed out self. And a friend struggling with cancer asked me about cannabis. Remember, in California, our law passed in 1996 for medical cannabis. This was around 2007, 2008-ish. And I didn't know very much except, what people learn about cannabis in high school and college, that kind of thing. And I started reading about it to see, is this real? Is this something she should do? And I got just caught up in the science of it. I had not been taught about the endocannabinoid system. And lo and behold, there's this whole body of data, like 20 years worth of data that I never even delved into, heard about. And I watched her have very significant benefits. I think a lot of people go into the cannabis industry because a loved one is suffering and they see benefits, and then you become really interested in this amazing plant's potential to help people. And so I immediately was intrigued. I started working in a practice that was already established here in Southern California, and within 2 months of meeting with people and talking with them and understanding how cannabis was helping them, that was it. I haven't looked back since.
Wow. And it's interesting. We share somewhat the same story. I knew somebody that was going through cancer, and it led me to cannabis. And you read about Phoenix here, CBD, how it just helps with nausea. So if anything, it helps you go through treatment.
And that's what happened with my friend, she wanted to quit treatment. Yeah. She had 2 children. And I just thought, that's probably not a great way to go. And I still feel bad about, people today who quit treatment when we know cannabis can help them. Mm-hmm. And for her, she had a good prognosis, but she had every side effect imaginable. Yeah. She had bone pain, she had nerve pain, she had nausea, she had vomiting, she was exhausted, but she couldn't really get any good quality sleep. She had no appetite, all the things that we know cannabis can help with. And it changed a lot for her. It made it so she could complete treatment. And that was,
that's a godsend.
It was everything for her.
Yeah. So endocannabinoid system, which I feel like we should change the name because I have a hard time saying it. I'm in the industry.
You could say ECS.
ECS, yeah. Not a lot of people know about this. So can you...
And they still don't teach it in school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you
So let me break it down. Yeah, I'm happy to break it down what it is. So one thing I always like to start to say is that, like in medical school, we learn you have, a central nervous system, you have a cardiorespiratory system, you have, a pulmonary system, reproductive system. So you have all these different systems, and you kind of learn about them separately. That's how it's taught, which I'm sure made sense back when they came up with that. But then, you look at, why does cannabis help with nausea, but it also helps with chronic pain, and it also helps with appetite, and it also helps with inflammation? Like, how can that be? Like, what system? Where does it fit? And it's because we have this underlying endocannabinoid system that is ubiquitous. It's everywhere in the body, basically. And it's a cellular signaling system. So the way to think about it is, and I like this analogy, think about like a room with a drum set inside the room, okay? And there's a door, and the door has a lock, okay? And there's someone inside the room banging on those drums. You can't even hear yourself think. Your neighbors are complaining. It's loud, okay? The room is a cell. And on the cell wall is a receptor, which acts like a lock. So it's like a lock in that door, that doorknob, okay? And there's a key that you can open that door, and you can yell to the person in there, dial it down, turn it down. And it dampens down that noise that's being made, that messaging that you're hearing, all those the drums. So the idea here is that we make inner cannabis compounds that act like keys that go to these cells that are making a lot of noise. They're sending message of nausea. They're sending a message of pain. They're sending an overfiring message producing a seizure. Okay? They're sending out a message of be inflamed, set off inflammation, right? And all of those signals can be very adaptive, right? If you touch a hot stove, you want to be able to get that signal to your brain and say, hey, take your finger away, or else your finger's going to burn up, right? And so there's adaptive messaging. Yes, you should have pain, you should have inflammation. But the problem is when it's too much, okay? There's too much noise. You need a feedback system to say, dial it down. And we have this inner system that is telling ourselves, so when we have any kind of traumatic insult, an infection, inflammation, sometimes our body can go haywire and give too much. And there's this endocannabinoid system that basically is triggered. You make this inner cannabis compound. It binds like a key in that lock, tells the cell, change the message.
Wow.
That's all it is a feedback loop. It's just me telling my kid to turn down put the drums on your headphones, right? I don't want to hear it. It's turn down the message, change the message. And it's really an elegant system. And the way to think about it is evolutionary wise, even like these very early creatures like sea squirts and these little hydra that they don't really have brains, right? But they needed some mechanism for survival, right? And so the type 1 cannabinoid receptor, that lock that sits on the cell, mostly in the brain and nervous system for the type 1, it's been described that evolutionary-wise, we developed that type 1 receptor as brakes on the immune system because the brain wants to be excitatory. If a bear's chasing you, you want to turn that on and fight or flight, right? Mm-hmm. But you need a way to rein that in. And so evolutionary-wise, we have this system that comes in and puts the brakes on. Type 2 cannabinoid receptors are not in the healthy brain, but they dial up in a sick brain, but they're basically in your immune system, your gut, they're all over your body. And it was proposed that they evolved as brakes on the inflammatory system or the immune system in response. Because when you think about it, so I'm going to give you a really good example. When somebody gets hit in the head, there's an initial injury, but then there's a secondary injury. And the secondary injury can be worse than the initial injury. And that secondary injury is this massive inflammation, brain swelling. And when you hear about somebody who has a bad brain injury, that's what's happening, okay? And what we know is that when somebody has a brain injury, believe it or not, their cells in the brain, they're called microglia, they dial up their cannabinoid receptors, and then your body dials up your inner cannabis-like compounds. And all we're doing when we take plant compounds is augmenting that system, is kind of assisting that system. People who have chronic illness, chronic pain, poor sleep, or just chronic sleep deprivation, chronic inflammation, a poor diet, they don't exercise, and this is often what happens in my practice. People come to me and they have all these chronic things going on, and it's stomach ache, it's inflammation, joint pain, it's poor sleep. Think about, you're checking off these boxes of all these things that the endocannabinoid system regulates. It helps regulate, and when you think about where the receptors are, they're pretty much everywhere, but they're highly dense in the brain, the gut, and the immune system. And when you think about it, that's what we need to survive.
Yeah.
We need our brain to be our computer. We need our gut to be able to function, to pull in nutrition and to avoid pulling in toxic compounds or contaminants. And we need our immune system, which regulates our inflammation. You want it to be adaptive, but you don't want it to be maladaptive. And often chronic illness is when you're in that maladaptive state. And by augmenting the endocannabinoid system, you can help get back into balance. So we kind of talk about something called endocannabinoid system deficiency, or really dysfunction. And when it's not working, and there's a ton of literature on this in terms of scientific literature, showing that dysfunctional endocannabinoid system is at least part of root cause for things like autism. So there's studies that show that kids with autism don't make enough inner cannabis, and that compound's called anandamide. There's two studies, one from Israel and one from Stanford University, that determined that children with autism just don't make enough of those. Interesting, right? And when you think about kids with autism, they have gut issues, they have brain issues, they have higher inflammation. It's a perfect target. Target the endocannabinoid system, get it back into balance. And lots of conditions. So depression, PTSD, dementia, all kinds of conditions have now, if you just go into the literature and type in endocannabinoid system dysfunction or deficiency, you will see the list of conditions is really very, very long. And a lot of people ask, well, is the system broken and then I get sick, or do I get sick and then the system can't keep up? It's both. It can be all of the above. It could be one or the other. So you could be born with an endocannabinoid system problem coded into your genes.
Wow. So in your example, let's say I have a head injury and my body now is overcompensating for it, I'm guessing. And taking CBD, tell the body, hey, chill out, don't overreact, and things will get better.
Dials down the inflammatory response.
Got it.
So, and even COVID, people don't die necessarily directly from COVID. They die from the inflammatory response triggered by COVID.
Oh.
And cannabinoids can, we haven't done any studies necessarily yet on people with COVID. And again, you have to remember the whole legal framework, the regulatory system is insane that we can't do research on this, because I'll give you an example. I reached out to a brilliant researcher in South Carolina who's done a huge amount of research on cannabinoids in terms of the inflammatory response, and all in test tubes in lab animals, right? Not in humans. Not allowed to study humans yet. So, but he proved in a study that when animals were, so I'll give you a quick lowdown on the study. So animals were injected with this toxin, and the toxin created massive inflammation and sepsis, which is a full-blown infection everywhere. And they split these animals into two groups, and one group got cannabis and the other group didn't. And the group that didn't get cannabis, all of those animals died after they got that injection. And in the group that got cannabis, all of them lived.
Wow.
Now, to me, that's enough data. Not everything that you see in animals converts to humans, but that's enough data to then go and say to people who have this particular awful response to a GI toxin or, like a neurotoxin, why wouldn't we we know what's going to happen to those people. Why wouldn't we get consent and give them cannabis and see what happens? And it was crazy. I had reached out to this doctor very early on in the COVID pandemic. And I said, do you think that cannabinoids might be the answer for these people who are going into the hospital and within a week or so are ending up on a ventilator with massive pulmonary inflammation that we don't have anything to combat? Why aren't we just at least trialing? And his answer to me was that he brought it up to his colleagues that worked in the clinical part of the hospital. He was in the research part, and they were worried about those people getting high. I am sorry. That is ridiculous because we know that some of those people are going to die, if not all of them, especially early on in the pandemic.
Like you weigh kind of like what's worse. And that is number one. That's the ultimate.
And they're giving, and remember, you're getting all kinds of drugs anyway.
Yeah.
People, when you're on a ventilator, you're mostly sedated. They don't want you fighting the ventilator. So you're on a whole boatload of drugs that are psychoactive. But somehow THC, the propaganda machine did a really good job about 100 years ago. And, we're still fighting that.
What is the science behind, because your practice is treating epilepsy?
Not all of it, but I do take care of a lot of children with epilepsy and some young adults, yes.
What's the science behind cannabis helping epilepsy?
Sure. So one of the largest areas of research where we have a true body of solid evidence is CBD for intractable epilepsy. Intractable means that the epilepsy is not responding to other medications. Out of all the people that get epilepsy, all children and adults as well, only 2/3 actually respond to medication, leaving 1 out of every 3 patients that are affected by epilepsy what we call intractable, which means they do not respond to the medications that have tried. And the definition is very specific. After 2 appropriate anticonvulsive medications have been trialed, either alone or together, the chance of responding after that's like less than 5%, depending on the study you look at. So it's very low. I've had patients come to me 7 drugs, 10 drugs, 12 drugs, 20 drugs. I'm not exaggerating. They're not on all of those, but over a period of time, they try this, it doesn't work, we take that out and we add another one, and then we stack this one and this one. And these drugs all have, if you read the scientific literature, the first thing you read is they all have these terrible side effects. They're sedating. An 8-year-old should not be falling asleep at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, right? An 8-year-old usually does not need a nap. I've had kids come into my office so over-medicated on seizure meds, but still having lots of seizures. They come in and they sit in the little chair and they put their head down, and you feel so bad for the family because their child is just basically tranquilized, but still having seizures, right? So, and there's been a huge discovery in the last 20 years of new medications coming out, but they still have this 1 in 3 do not respond. CBD was looked at, back in the historical literature, there are many reports of cannabis helping with spasms, right? Which we think they mean seizures. That's just in the historical literature. But one of the first reports was in the 1980s where Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, who is kind of well known as the father or grandfather of medical cannabis, he's the one who discovered isolated THC back in 1964, named it THC, and then went on to study cannabis for 50 plus years. He did a study, a small one, I think it was under 10 patients, where he gave them CBD, and these were patients with intractable epilepsy who responded. And nobody ran with it, though, and that's because cannabis is Schedule 1. It was in the 80s. Don't do drugs, DARE, all of that. And unfortunately, being categorized there just completely eliminated it as an option. And then, there were a few more studies after that. And then it was really in 2013 when little Charlotte, a little girl with Dravet syndrome, which is a very difficult, severe pediatric epilepsy genetic condition, was on a documentary on CNN. And her mother, she was sent home basically to die. The doctor said, we have nothing for you. She was just seizing and seizing. I think 1,200 seizures a month they counted.
Oh my God.
Can you imagine, right? And watching your child like that is just traumatizing to everybody. And her mom had heard about maybe this might work, and she tracked down some cannabis that they called hippie's disappointment because nobody got high off it because it was high CBD, low THC. And they made it into an oil and they gave it to her, and she basically stopped having seizures. And that was on a documentary in August 2013. If people are interested, I believe it's on YouTube. It's called Weed with Dr. Sanjay Gupta from CNN. And he's done some subsequent. But that was when he came out and said, I've changed my tune. I am no longer anti-cannabis. This could be a medicine for people. And he really put the mainstream stamp of approval. So thanks to him. And in my practice, we started getting calls. I was already in practice 5 years, mostly seeing adults. I started getting calls from parents saying, do you have this CBD? Can you help us? And of course, there's a legality. You don't want your child taken away from you because you're trying something that's not considered conventional or maybe fringe. And at that time it was. And I told people, just keep it to yourself until you could tell your neurologist, but feel them out first, because this is very new and very controversial. But, I started recommending CBD. At the time, it was even almost impossible to find. And then a handful of companies popped up very quickly. And I started collecting data, and we started seeing this incredible response rate. And it's not perfect. Nothing is for these families. There's no if their magic medicine existed, we'd all take it, right? So, but for some patients, and it's the majority of patients, what we're seeing with whole plant CBD dominant, based on the literature, is somewhere around an 80% response rate. I published a report of my patients combined with a neurologist patients in Seattle, and we had an 86% response rate, meaning not seizure freedom, but did your child have any seizure reduction from cannabis? 86% of the patients. UCLA looked at 115 patients and just to survey them. They were not treating those patients. Almost all of those patients were my patients, but they collected this survey and they found 85% had a response rate. And in Israel, there was a report that came out, I think it was 89%. So we're in the 80%, right, where patients have some response. Some of these families have been told your child will never be seizure-free. And what we're seeing now is somewhere between a 10 and 15% seizure freedom in this, what we call difficult to treat group. Why wouldn't we offer that? These kids have developing brains. We know seizures can cause brain damage. Okay? I'm not worried about CBD causing brain damage, especially under medical supervision. It's just not what we see. And now we have 2013 to 2025, let's say, even though it's 2026 right now, early 26, we have now 12 years of data, and in the scientific literature, CBD is considered an acceptable treatment for intractable pediatric epilepsy, either as the main medicine or as an adjunct, meaning an add-on to other medications. And there's some evidence in literature that certain drugs actually, there may be some benefit of combining certain medications. And that's still kind of being sorted out, but there's some evidence there. And I definitely see that in my practice as well. And it's not magic. So how does CBD work, right? Well, all cannabinoids are what we call non-selective compounds. They have multiple targets. So it's not just that cannabinoid receptor that CBD or THC targets. They also target a family of receptors, or what we call ion channels, called TRP channels, TRP, and we just call them TRP channels. These are little gates that live in the cell wall that allow like potassium and calcium and other ions to go in and out of the cell, and that's kind of how an electrical message is sent. And CBD targets the trip channels. It targets another type of receptor called GPR55 receptor. It blocks that receptor because that receptor propagates seizures. CBD also makes it so that your body doesn't break down your inner cannabis-like compound so easily. CBD actually blocks the enzyme from breaking down your inner cannabis, lets your inner cannabis last longer. Well, your inner cannabis, what's its role? Calm brain firing, less pain, less nausea, less anxiety, right? And so by promoting, what CBD is doing is it's enhancing your body's own natural system to heal itself. It's so fascinating, right?
Yeah. Wow.
And CBD has like over 75 targets. I mean, that's like 2 lectures in and of itself if I ever had to go through all of that. But the reality is that for epilepsy, we don't know everything. I think there's a lot more to discover. It's still in its infancy, but we know specific mechanisms. And so CBD, because it targets GPR55 trip channels, anandamide, it targets also a compound called adenosine, which is a endogenous or an inner anticonvulsive compound. It calms brain firing. CBD inhibits the little molecule that, like the little chauffeur that drives it around and lets it last a little bit longer. So again, it enhancing the body's own system. But it's all of these effects that we sometimes call multimodal effects, multi-targeted or stacked. Some people call it polypharmacy. There's a lot of words for it, but it's not just one direct target. It's multiple targets that all lead to lowering of all of that excessive firing in the brain.
How long, if somebody were to take CBD, how often do they have to take it to maintain that impact?
Sure. Well, I mean, if somebody has a seizure disorder, they have a seizure disorder. Mm-hmm. In conventional medicine, if you can get somebody seizure free it's usually a 2-year period, and they do an EEG and the EEG looks good, sometimes they'll take you off the medicine. If you have an underlying issue like a genetic syndrome, or, let's say you hit your head and you had a bleed inside your brain and now you've got some scar tissue, that's there. That's a trigger for seizures. So that's a lifetime of medicine. But I'll tell you right now, I'd rather take plant medicine for my life than for pharmaceuticals for my life. I mean, right? But at the same time, this is not easy. It's not like you go on CBD and you're seizure free. That is not what happens. There's a very small percentage of patients, and I know a few of them who from the first dose of CBD didn't have seizures anymore, and their parents just kept giving, CBD. But for the most patients, we start at a low dose. The saying, start low and go slow. It kind of applies to this. You start at a certain weight-based, and we do weight-based in children because they grow. We don't want them to outgrow their therapeutic dose. Mm-hmm. So we start at a certain, 1 milligram per kilo per day, and you titrate up looking for the dose that gives the best result without any side effects. And it's not just CBD. THC is an anticonvulsant. CBDV is an anticonvulsant.
I've never heard of CBDV before.
Yep, cannabidivarin. And it's been on the market now for a couple years. And believe it or not, there's one study in human children that came out of Australia, 5 little girls with Rett syndrome, that they gave CBDV to, and there was like a 79% response rate, meaning significant reduction of seizures in, I think, 4 out of the 5 kids. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, seizures are horrific to live with. They're horrific to witness in your own child. Anything and everything should be on the table, as long as it's not dangerous. We know CBD is not dangerous. You just have to be a good doctor, a good clinician, and make sure you know what medicines the child's on. Make sure you're staying in close contact to see, about the dosing and what you're doing. Make sure that there aren't any, reasons not to be on CBD, that kind of thing. But in general, one of the best things about CBD that parents report is many of the anti-seizure conventional medicines have side effects. It can suppress your bone marrow, create terrible sedation, affect your kidney affect your liver tests. a whole slew of side effects, double vision, believe it or not. These are strong brain drugs, right? With CBD, and it's in the literature, not just in my practice, but it's reported in the literature, positive effects beyond seizure control. So what does that mean? More alert and awake. Memory is better. For some kids, their speech improves. I had a 9-year-old that came to me who didn't read and write, and she learned to read and write on CBD. By 11, she was kind of caught up to her grade.
Wow.
It was the seizures holding her back, and that she wasn't a responder to any of the medications. And once she got on CBD, now she's not, and she's still my patient now. We're going on like 12 years. She's one of my first patients I saw. She's not fully seizure free, but boy, does she have a really decent life. She's on CBD and CBDV. Her comprehension, her speech, her interactions, her ability to leave the home, and her mom doesn't have to worry that she's going to have a seizure out in the real world, right? Because now she's a young adult and wants to kind of spread her wings and fly. It is, I make it sound like a miracle, and I write in my book, it's not a miracle, it's just science. And we are smart enough to understand these compounds, and we are smart enough to utilize them as medicines. We have to stop with all the reefer madness and the baggage.
Yeah.
And really the key, I think, I'm just going to say one of the issues we have is that, and clinicians, doctors, the medical community is probably the worst at this. They can't separate medical from recreational use, right? And I live in the world of medical, so I medically supervise, so I see good results. And here and there you have somebody calls me and says, oh, I have a side effect, and we fix it. We take that away. We change the regimen, you change the dose, the timing, the product, the cannabinoid. Lots of things you can do to avoid side effects. This conflation of it can't be medical because there's people struggling with it. Now, we have that with opioids, and yet we still write prescriptions for, I don't, but other people do write prescriptions for opioids. We need to separate medical and recreational use. And I would say under the recreational umbrella, or let's say adult use umbrella, there's a percentage of people that have problematic use.
Yeah. Just like anything. You can eat too many sardines.
Yeah, you can. And, when you think about some of the harms in this world, look, we live in a country where alcohol and tobacco are fully legal. They're not even on the Controlled Substance Act, right? And people die every year from tobacco and alcohol related complications, lung cancer, traffic accidents, cirrhosis of the liver. I could go on. And it's really just about education. And I would bet that if this country adopted, when I'm already in my 60s, I can't believe I'm saying that, but when I was in elementary school, they taught us sex ed in the 5th grade. Why aren't we teaching about cannabis and other substances early on, before kids are really exposed to stuff? You plant the seed, make good decisions, but also to say, don't do drugs. What does that do? I got to figure out what drugs do. They don't want me to do it. I think I want to do it. I'm curious, right? Because you put the big no on it. So I think that what we have to do is start educating our young people and then build on that education into the teenage years. Because most teenagers really don't hear you when you're telling them to not do something. They know better. So, to me, it's really about, because, we know our kids are going to get exposed to alcohol, tobacco, drug, any kind of drug, substances, whatever, as they go through school. And why wouldn't we want to prepare them and give them the knowledge to make good decisions, right?
Yeah. Well, it's getting in front and being able to control the narrative, because the narrative will be there, and it's whether parents or teachers or, they can learn from somewhere else. So pick your poison,
right.
kind of thing.
That's right. And most of them are on the internet, and, that you completely lose control of the narrative that way. You don't know what they're looking at.
Yeah.
Are they looking at something that implants like good decision making, or something that, that kind of looks cool, I want to try that, right?
CBD and THC get all the love and all the attention, and there are other cannabinoids that the public don't really know about, like CBN, CBG, THCV, which is one compound that I'm searching for because I'm a productivity nut. Can you shed light on other cannabinoids that people should look into and
Sure.
why should they pay attention to these?
Sure. So CBG is now kind of considered not, and by the way, we call THC and CBD the major cannabinoids, and then we kind of call the rest the minor. But CBG has kind of moved up from the minor leagues, if you ask me. CBG stands for cannabigerol. CBG is created when you heat the raw plant kind of in its more immature phase, just because CBGA is the kind of the mother compound to all plants, cannabigerolic acid. And when you heat that up, it becomes CBG, the same way THCA, when you heat it up, becomes THC. So remember, in the plant, they're raw. And when we humans apply heat, we convert them to the neutral, which we know is THC, CBD, and CBG, and CBC as well. So CBG is a compound that, it's crazy. It's available, very few studies. But there was a survey a number of years ago of 127 patients consumers using CBG, and what they found was that it helped with pain, inflammation, anxiety, depression, and sleep. So it sounds familiar, right? So does THC do that? So does CBD do that? But people were highly satisfied. In fact, when they asked the participants of this survey how superior was, or, compared to if you ever took a conventional medicine for, let's say, anxiety, was CBG superior? And if so, how much? So it turns out something like 70-80% of people found CBG to be superior to their pharmaceuticals for these various indications like anxiety, depression, inflammation, pain, and sleep. Wow. And so I know it's a high number. And even if it's a placebo effect, that's okay, because it's got less side effects and it has a much safer profile. I don't really see that much side effects with CBG. What I see with CBG is occasionally if someone for some people it's alerting. So is CBD sometimes alerting. And it's almost like taking a, quote, sativa at nighttime right before bed. You're going to stay up, right? So CBG can sometimes be alerting for people. And when I tell people to try CBG, if I'm instructing them to do so, I usually tell them, just take it in the morning, see how it affects you. But a lot of people say that CBG helps with sleep because it's indirectly helping with pain, anxiety, right? So if you lay down at night and your head isn't spinning and your back isn't hurting you, you can fall asleep. So it doesn't appear to be a direct sleep initiator like THC is, but it like CBD, and a lot of people say CBD helps them sleep. Same thing. Doesn't appear, based on the research, to have a direct linked or a direct mechanism for sleep. It's really more so it's helping with other things. Remember that calm brain, putting you, not sending message of pain, not sending message of anxiety. You can fall asleep. So CBG also is really interesting because it's the only cannabinoid that targets something called the alpha-2 adrenergic receptor. And that receptor is like your fight or flight receptor. And when you activate that receptor, it's very calming. And that receptor is already a target of medicines, so they sometimes give children with autism a medicine that hits that receptor.
Oh, wow.
That receptor is involved in your blood pressure as well. There's a lot of people with PTSD now. I go online and I read Reddit and all kinds of things to see what people are saying in addition to just my patients. And many people report that CBG is really great for non-impairing, so no high, daytime anxiety without any sedating effects. So that's really nice, right? I did some research on children with autism where we collected saliva and we looked at various what we call metabolites or biomarkers in the saliva. And then we collected those biomarkers before they took their medical cannabis in the morning and a couple hours after they took their medical cannabis. And what we were trying to do is to see, do these metabolites, these little chemicals that exist in our brain and body, do they change in response to cannabis, and does it correlate to the improvements reported by the parents? And basically the answer was yes. The parents are reporting, difficult behaviors in the morning. They give them their cannabis. They report better behaviors in the afternoon. But what's happening in the physiology, right? And that's what we were looking at. And what's really interesting is after we were kind of did all this research, we took the data and we put it through machine learning, and we found that CBG has its own slew of targets, different from CBD and THC. And when we created like this Venn diagram of the overlap, CBG overlapped with CBD and CBG overlapped with THC, but THC and CBD did not overlap with each other.
Oh, wow.
So CBG, we concluded, and there were a couple other reports in the literature of this, which were new at the time, and it's kind of very rewarding to find something in your research that supports somebody else's kind of new hypothesis. So basically what we figured out was CBG resides pharmacologically between CBD and between THC. So it's non-impairing like CBD, but you don't need really high doses. Like you don't need big doses unless you have huge tolerance. For THC, most medical patients are taking lower doses of THC, right? Because they don't overdo. But it's interesting because you can get away with lower doses of CBG. It acts similarly to THC and CBD and overlaps a little bit with those. It's really interesting. CBDV is another one I mentioned. There's not a lot of research, but it's being looked at for autism and epilepsy. Again, dialing down overexcited brain, right? CBN, I know you've heard of CBN, cannabinol. So cannabinol is one that everybody was claiming worked great for sleep. And there was a report in 2021 that looked at the literature and found nothing to support scientifically that it helped with sleep. But then a report came out at the end of 2023 where they compared 20 milligrams of CBN with placebo and with various combinations of CBN with CBD. And it turns out that 20 milligrams of CBN, and they did compare to placebo, so it looks like this is, that it's not by chance or a placebo effect. That 20 milligrams of CBN did have some meaningful benefits for sleep. And
Oh, wow.
like reducing sleep disturbance and improving, what was the other thing? So reduced, just a meaningful effect on sleep, if I recall correctly. And so some people, CBN is just the breakdown product of THC, right? So if you leave THC laying around, it ages from heat, light, exposure to air, oxygen. And so it oxidizes and it changes to CBN. And so it's kind of like I joke around, old pot, right? But really it has very similar targets as THC, but it has about the quarter of the potency. So I just don't see people getting high off CBN. In dispensaries here in California, we see a lot of sleep products. They're made to promote sleep, specifically for sleep, that combo CBN and THC together. And then, on the unregulated hemp market, you can get CBN without very much THC in it. And so it's available for people to try for sleep. It also targets, what's interesting about CBN is that it has a preference for the type 2 cannabinoid receptor, meaning that's why it doesn't cause so much high. But that type 2 cannabinoid receptor, remember, is involved a lot in inflammation. And so CBN, all of these compounds are high anti-inflammatory potential. Yeah, and then I guess there's CBDA, which is one that I love personally. It's the raw form of CBD. I'll tell you a funny story. Many, many years ago so I remember I started doing this in 2008. It must have been 2009 or 2010. This young guy came into my office. He had torn his bicep. He was a bodybuilder. He had torn his bicep muscle and had to have surgery. And he brought in all his paperwork to prove that he had chronic pain with this bicep. And it was really bothering him because he's a bodybuilder, you want to be able to show your guns and all of that. In the conversation, are you using cannabis? Oh yeah, I use it all the time. I said, oh, okay, how do you take it? Remember, this is pre-2013. It's all THC on the market. He goes, oh, well, I eat it. I go, oh, so you get edibles? He says, oh, no, I eat the raw flower. And I said, kind of looked at him like, what? I eat the raw flower. I just hadn't heard of that. You know, and, I'm sure anybody listening who's like an OG is probably rolling their eyes, but I just had not heard of that at that point in my career or in my experience with cannabis. And so, not to mention, I couldn't imagine the taste, raw flower. And he said, yeah, he goes, I don't get high, but gosh, my pain goes away. So I'm like, what is this guy talking about? Like, I have not read that study. So I go delving into the research, and there really isn't very much, but it appears that the acid forms, which are the unheated forms, so the raw plant, THCA, CBDA, CBGA, have potent anti-inflammatory effects. Now, I like CBDA because it has virtually no THC in it at all, because remember, it's coming from a plant that's a dominant CBD genetics. It doesn't have much THC in it. And again, because it's raw, so it's going to have very little. So it's a nice option for people who either don't like THC, who can't access THC legally, or get drug tested, right? And, I have a family member who needs a knee replacement, who couldn't walk up and down stairs, was just miserable. He's an avid athlete. He destroyed his knee. Now he needs a knee replacement. He's not very old. He's in his 50s. And he doesn't want to take opioids, so he's suffering. And I put him on CBDA. And here we are now years later, probably 3 years later. No knee replacement, playing tennis, able to walk up and down stairs, can go for a 5-mile hike. It's just an amazing response. I have an uncle, unfortunately, he passed away this past year in his mid-90s, but he had terrible bone-on-bone knee joints. I mean, his knees were so destroyed that he had malformations. He was really bow-legged because the bones just, everything is just falling apart, basically. And I had him on CBDA. He's on a slew of heart meds, kidney meds, all kinds of medications, so you want to be super careful. This man went from not being able to walk to being able to walk. He got 2 good years of pain relief before he passed away.
So if he were to take CBD and not CBDA, would it have been the same results?
So it really interesting. I can't answer that question without doing that trial in that person, because we're all different in the way we respond. CBD is quite good for inflammatory pain. However, and believe it or not, we don't have a lot of studies on arthritis and on CBD in humans. There's hardly any. It's shocking. Hardly any studies. And that's also because, remember, it's just hard to get the funding and get approval to do the study. I will share with you that before CBDA was available, I had lots of patients saying CBD worked well for a joint. I remember this woman who came in with her adult daughter. She was probably in her late 70s, and she wanted to be able to play with her grandchildren. And she had, I think for her, it was a hip. She had terrible hip pain. She was trying not to have a hip replacement. She was on medication. She just wasn't ready to have the hip replacement surgery yet because she was still but she said getting on the floor and getting off the floor was like very, very difficult. After watching her grandchildren for 2 hours, she's like, I got to take some pain medicine and sit down. You know how active kids are. You're running around, you're keeping your eye on them, you're not sitting down. And she got very good pain relief with CBD. For my uncle, he was on medication for his heart that I didn't want to mess with. CBD in higher doses that are often needed for not always higher doses, but for him, his osteoarthritis was so severe. So this is like where clinical decision making comes in, right? So I've got all these compounds. Which do I think is going to suit the bill or fit him the best? And so for him, I didn't want to do CBD because I didn't want to interfere with the metabolism of his other drugs. Even though it was low risk, it's still something to consider. And if I have something else that you can get away with. Now, one thing I didn't tell you is that for CBDA is less what we call lipophilic, fat-loving. So it's more bioavailable. We can absorb more.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so with CBD, you have to overcome this really poor absorption. So you have to take a higher dose. Range of dosing for CBD is what we call very wide. I've got patients at like 20 milligrams, 10, 20, 30 milligrams a day. And I've got other patients at 600 plus milligrams a day.
Wow.
Now, usually those are sicker people who kind of haven't found anything else to work and they're willing to pay for that high dose of CBD. But if I can get away with a lower dose, less costly, because remember, all of this is out of pocket for people. So, over the years, as these compounds became available, I kind of switched up my first line. CBDA moves up because now it's available and I'm going to try that first.
That's
Some
what I was
people,
going to ask
yeah,
you. But like, when would
yeah.
you not go with CBDA versus CBD?
So like in older people, CBD can be in higher doses, can be somewhat sedating. So you don't want to sedate somebody who might be at a risk for a fall if they have to get up to pee in the middle of the night, even if, you just kind of learn. That's kind of the art of the practice of medicine, is you kind of learn which scenarios to use which compounds. But the reality is it's still a bit of trial and error. The research I did with the biomarkers is, the future of that research is to be able to collect saliva and test people to see if they're even a candidate, right? Are the biomarkers that respond to cannabis abnormal, and can we correct them? Kind of like having a high cholesterol, can I bring it down with medicine, right? And then the biomarker, if you have a baseline and then you treat somebody, it's great to get feedback from the patient, but I'd love to see, love to get a test to see exactly what we're targeting, and then to see if there's something, maybe CBG targets this pathway and I only have the patient on CBD, and when I get those test results back, it shows that, pathway X, Y, and Z that respond to CBG are still a little bit off, then I know what's next. It will help us, because remember, we make clinical decisions, but it's also nice to have some objective data, which there does not exist right now.
Well,
This
hopefully with
research.
this.
Yeah, no, and it's so easy because, the way to do it, and the company's called Camformatics. I'm going to give them a little shout out. I heard about them, they heard about me. We got together and did the research, and the research is applicable beyond autism. It's for dementia, chronic pain, endometriosis. Like, we can actually help patients find their cannabis regimen sooner rather than later and take out some of the trial and error, if that makes any sense. It's just, and that's kind of what I do, is I help patients find that cannabis regimen that gives them the best results without side effects. That is the goal.
What do you know about THCV?
So, tetrahydrocannabivarin. So the varins is like a little subgroup of cannabinoids, and they have a shorter tail. That's the little propyl tail. I think that's what they call it. The propyl tail is, instead of 5 carbons, it's 3 carbons, which completely changes the activity. But THCV, there's not a lot of research. But what are people, some of the research that has been done focuses on metabolic issues, meaning like insulin sensitivity and how your body handles calories and energy. And THCV in lower doses blocks that receptor, or kind of tells that it doesn't trigger the receptor. It's not the key in the lock. It's more like I'm putting cement over the keyhole. Okay. And so you don't get high with lower doses of THCV, but through other mechanisms, what we call non-cannabinoid receptor mechanisms, it can tell your body to be a little bit more efficient with managing glucose and energy. Okay. And it can help with what we call metabolic syndrome, which is when you have high blood pressure, obesity, your lipid panel is off. THCV, in blocking that receptor, helps you kind of shift into let's say, a better metabolic picture, if that, okay. Wow. And there's some studies that looked at but in higher doses, what's interesting about THCV is it has a different effect, which is then it does bind to the receptor. So then it can cause. Now, THCV is hard to find on the market without THC in it.
Yeah.
And so when somebody calls me and says, I have this product with THCV and THC and I have this effect, it's like, well, are they canceling each other out?
Yeah.
This is binding to the receptor. This is blocking the receptor. And one thing to be very careful with THCV is that, and it's different than a synthetic cannabinoid inhibitor, or endocannabinoid or cannabinoid receptor inhibitor. There was a drug in Europe that was on the market, I want to say about 15 years ago. It was called Rimonabant, and it was a weight loss drug. So think about THC. You take it, you get the munchies. Okay? Well, if you block the receptor, it reduces your appetite. So it was sold on the market as a weight loss drug, and people lost weight. But guess what else happened? They became depressed and anxious, and there was an increase in suicidal ideation. Now, I don't expect THCV to do that because it's natural. This was a pharmaceutical, so it's very different. But THCV really has not been well categorized. There are people who say it lowers their anxiety and keeps them alert. That's probably what you're referring to when you first brought it up, right? Mm-hmm. That it can help with focus. A lot of, in the kind of, the anecdotal world, people with PTSD they say it's helpful for anxiety. And always my question is, well, what are you taking exactly? Is there some THC in there? Because maybe that little bit of THC in there is doing the trick. So as a scientist, I kind of want to understand.
Yeah. And I heard that you can't, THCV is really hard to find in the plant, and you can't really create it unless it's synthesized, which then, there's a lot of byproducts, I'm assuming, that you're consuming with it.
Yeah, and with all these synthetic cannabinoids that are out there now, the THOP and all the, my husband calls it alphabet soup. I am a big proponent of natural.
Yeah.
Mother Nature gives us this great plant that has lots of compounds in it. And like I said, we're smart enough to understand how to use it as medicine. We don't need to, and there are people out there, well, what if we synthesize something new that can save people's lives? I'm on board, but you better show me that that's safe, what you just synthesized. Because I know the compounds from the cannabis plant are safe.
Yeah.
Right? They're not in proper use, let's say.
Yeah, I had someone on the pod that really opened my eyes, and he has his business is he does testing. So he tests, you get samples and he'll test it. And he said that a lot of synthetically derived cannabinoids, you can extract the cannabinoid, but there's not a lot of control over the waste or what else.
And that's exactly when you think about it, right? So right now what's happening is we're seeing this backlash from the, quote, loophole in the Farm Bill where people are taking CBD that is legal, and they're putting it through a chemical process to create Delta 9 and Delta 8 THC. And poor Delta 8 is getting beat up. It's a beautiful compound. It's in the plant. It's just in teeny tiny amounts in the natural plant. Dr. Meshulam actually, in his laboratory, took CBD and created Delta 8 THC with it, but like 99% pure, and gave it to children getting chemotherapy, and it stopped vomiting and nausea in 100% of cases.
Oh, wow.
This is back in 1995, and nobody did anything with that. That would be great. But the problem is that you have people who are taking CBD and they're converting it, and they're getting some Delta 8 and some Delta 9, and then there's this kind of unknown.
Yeah.
What's in there? And we are actually seeing reports in the literature of people having suicidal ideation. It's like synthetic, it's like K2, like spice, It's synthetics, and they're novel, which means that we've not seen them before. We have no toxicology on them, and we don't know. So we've got reports of people having difficult to treat depression, suicidal ideation, excessive anxiety, psychosis. And there's one really scary report, if that's not scary enough, psychosis, a report of someone whose vision changed, and they have something called visual snow, which, looks like static, and they lost their vision, and now they only have this static vision, and that came from a contaminated synthetic vape. And what I'll tell people is, prohibition doesn't work. We need to just legalize this across the country so that we don't have this need or this gap to fill that where people fill it with synthetics.
Yeah.
Right?
That's unfortunate. And it puts such a bad name to the plant itself because the general public, they don't know.
That's right. People don't know, is it natural or is it synthetic? That's right.
Yeah.
Nobody knows. And, we're getting to a point where hopefully things will be required to be labeled so that people will know. But at the same time, it absolutely has given natural cannabis a black eye.
Terrible. Dr. Bonni, I want to thank you so much for joining. You dropped so much knowledge. I learned so much. This is one of the interviews, the podcast episodes that I was looking forward to the most.
Oh, well, thank you.
Well, thank you for coming on. I have to have you back. You have to come back, please. I picked up your book. For you guys that are listening, Cannabis is Medicine. Pick up that book. I have to have you back. After I read that book, I think I'll have so many more questions.
Sure. Well, and just be aware too, some of it, because it was written 5 years, closed 5 years ago and then put out on the market, it's missing some of the more recent details. And so if you see something in there and you say, why is it missing that information? It's because it was written a number of years ago. And the information highway for cannabis is like being flooded with studies and research. And of course, there's good research and there's bad research. But one thing, if I could, Tommy, I just want to plug something if I could, which is
please.
A new company I started called Goldstein Wellness. So it's goldsteinwellness.com. And basically what it is an educational program for clinicians, because most clinicians do not get education on the endocannabinoid system or how to use cannabis as medicine in their patients. In fact, they're still telling their patients don't use cannabis, which I find really egregious, especially in a patient who's suffering, because I think once you learn the medical side of it, there is no, quote, other side. It's medical use. And so we have a free sign up and a free educational program. It's like everything I know, I put into the videos. So there's something like 50 videos on the website for people to learn everything from the basics of the endocannabinoid system to drug interactions, safety and precautions, clinical pearls, all the various different cannabinoids. Also, there's condition videos like autism, epilepsy, chronic pain. And then the really nice thing, what I think is the best part, is that if you are a patient looking for help, there are not very many cannabis clinicians around. A lot of doctors, nurses still don't want to be involved with cannabis. We have over, I think at this point, 300 clinicians who have signed up. And so if you're a patient and you're looking for help, we have clinicians from every state in the U.S. So if you go on and register, we don't use your email for anything other than to connect you with people who are licensed in your state to help you. Because it kind of does have to be state-based in a way, because, you want to know the laws in the state and also the products in those states.
That's amazing. How can our listeners find you?
So just go, so I have a Instagram, Bonni Goldstein MD, and Bonni, Bonni, and then Goldstein MD, goldsteinwellness.com. You can just Google me. You'll find, I also have a YouTube channel with some videos, and trying to think what else. I'm on LinkedIn as well.
Dr. Bonni, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, and I hope to see you soon and come back and we can talk about some more stuff.
Definitely.
Thanks for listening to the KayaCast podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast in your favorite podcast app or visit our website to access